This is chapter 13, where we're going to look at the peripheral nervous system as well as looking at some reflexes. In its broadest definition, sensation is the conscious or sometimes even subconscious awareness of changes in the external or even internal environment. Now, like we learned a couple chapters ago, perception, this is going to be the conscious interpretation of sensations, and it's primarily a function of the cerebral cortex. Now, each unique type of sensation, like pain, touch, vision, or hearing, these are called a sensory modality. Now, the different sensory modalities can be grouped into two classes, either in general senses or special senses. Now, general senses refer both to somatic and visceral senses. Somatic senses include tactile sensations like touch, vibration, itch, or even tickling. It also refers to thermal sensations, pain, and proprioceptive sensations. Visceral sensations, on the other hand, provide information about conditions within internal organs. So that's what visceral means. So for example, pressure, stretch, chemicals, nausea, hunger, temperature, all these things within our internal organs are provided by our visceral general sense. The special senses include the sensory modalities like smell, taste, vision, hearing, and equilibrium or balance. Several structural and functional characteristics of sensory receptors can be used to group them into different classes. So here we can put our characteristics used to group. So characteristics used to group sensory receptors into different classes. Our first one is going to be microscopic structure. We can also use the location of the receptor themselves. We can use the origin of the stimuli that activates them. And we can also use the type of stimulus detected. Now, at a microscopic level, sensory receptors may be one of the following. I'll put sensory receptor types here. So our first one is going to be free nerve endings on first-order sensory neurons. I'll just put first order like this. Our second sensory receptor type is going to be encapsulated nerve endings, again on those first order sensory neurons. Just put this because it's still on those first order sensory neurons. And then our third sensory receptor type are separate cells that synapse with first order neurons. Now recall that at the dendrites, they produce a graded potential that triggers a nerve impulse if it reaches threshold potential. Now sensory receptors produce two different kinds of graded potentials. So these are generator potentials. So our different types of graded potentials. Our first one is a generator potential. And also a receptor potential. So here we have a first order sensory neuron with these free nerve endings. So when stimulated, the dendrites of free nerve endings and even encapsulated nerve endings and the receptive part of olfactory receptors will all produce a generator potential. Now, when that generator potential is large enough, it will generate an action potential. Remember, another name for a nerve impulse. So we'll just put AP here to represent an action potential. In other words, the nerve impulse. So our first example on the top here is the first order sensory neurons with free nerve endings. And we can see these free nerve endings here. Free nerve endings are bare dendrites that lack any form of structural specialization. So these types of receptors are going to include receptors for pain, temperature, itch, tickling, and some touch sensations. Not very many, but a couple touch sensations are also going to be free nerve endings. These other ones down here, the encapsulated nerve ending, and also the separate receptor here. We're going to talk about those in the following slides. Receptors for other somatic and visceral sensations like pressure, vibration, and some touch sensations are going to be encapsulated nerve endings. So this is where the dendrites are enclosed in a connective tissue capsule that has a very distinct microscopic structure. So an example is this one here, which is a lamellated corpuscle. Now, different types of capsules will enhance the sensitivity or specificity of the receptor. But you can still see here this encapsulated nerve ending creates a generator potential that if it is high enough to reach threshold, it will trigger a nerve impulse to travel along the axon of the neuron. Sensory receptors for some special senses are going to be specialized separate cells that synapse with sensory neurons. So these are going to include hair cells in the inner ear for hearing and also for equilibrium. This will also include gustatory receptor cells in taste buds, and also photoreceptors in the retina of the eye for vision. These are all going to be these specialized separate cells that synapse with sensory neurons. So our other type of graded potential, a receptor potential, is going to occur here. So remember, this receptor potential is a graded potential that's produced by sensory receptors that are separate cells. Like here we can see a gustatory receptor. So this is a separate cell that produces a receptor potential. And receptor potentials will trigger the release of neurotransmitters through the exocytosis of synaptic vesicles in that separate cell. The neurotransmitters will then diffuse across the membrane and then trigger a nerve impulse in the axon of the sensory neuron. So that's a receptor potential. So receptor potentials occur in separate cells. Those are specialized senses. Now, another way to group sensory receptors is based on the location of receptors and then also the origin of the stimuli that activate them. So this type of classification is going to give us 3 different types of receptors. These are exteroreceptors, interoreceptors, and proprioceptors. Oops. So receptors, that's ORS. So the first one we have here is the exteroreceptors. So exteroreceptors are going to be located at or near the external surface of the body, and they're going to provide information about the external environment. So that's going to be the main classification of the exteroreceptors. Provide information about the external environment. So sensations of hearing, vision, smell, taste, touch, pressure, vibration, temperature, pain, these are all going to be conveyed by exteroreceptors. So this is just another way that we can classify sensory receptors. The other type that we looked at with these different specializations of sensory receptors, like if they had an encapsulated nerve ending or free nerve dendrites, this would be another type of classification. So you may have encapsulated nerve endings that are exteroreceptors. We also may have free nerve endings that are exteroreceptors. So it's just another way to think of how to classify sensory receptors. Next, we have interoreceptors. These are located in blood vessels, visceral organs, even in muscles and the nervous system. And they're going to monitor conditions of the internal environment. So we'll write this out here. They're found like in blood vessels, visceral organs, muscles, nervous tissue. So interoreceptors really are going to just give us information about our internal environment. Now, the nerve impulses provided by these interoreceptors, usually we don't consciously perceive them, but the activation of interoreceptors by really strong stimuli may be felt as pain or pressure. So we may interpret it as pain or pressure. Next, we have the proprioceptors. These are going to be located in muscles, tendons, joints, and the inner ear. Now, proprioceptors provide information about body position, about muscle length and muscle tension, and also the position and movement of our joints. Now, you also have classification of receptors due to the type of stimulus detected. So at the bottom here we have these types of stimulus detected. So we would have things like mechanoreceptors. So these are going to be sensitive to mechanical stimuli. There's also thermal receptors. These detect changes in temperature. Nociceptors. These respond to painful stimuli, resulting in physical or chemical damage to tissue. So this all have to do with pain. Photoreceptors detect light. So it allows you to detect light that strikes the retina in your eye. Chemoreceptors detect chemicals. This is going to be chemicals in the mouth, nose, and body fluids. And then osmoreceptors, these detect the osmotic pressure of body fluids. In this table too, we also have those other types of classification that we have gone over just before. So we have structure with the free nerve endings, encapsulated nerve endings, and separate cells. And then we also have the receptor location and activating stimuli. So again, a nice summary table that will help you to study. Somatic sensations, these are going to arise from stimulation of sensory receptors embedded in the skin or subcutaneous layer in the mucous membranes of the mouth, vagina, anus, in the muscles, tendons, joints, and in the inner ear. So it's going to be lots of internal locations that we get these somatic sensations. Now there are 4 modalities of somatic sensation. These are going to be tactile, thermal, pain, and proprioceptive. Tactile sensations, on the other hand, these include touch, pressure, vibration, itch, and tickle. Now there are 2 types of touch receptors. These are rapidly adapting receptors and slowly adapting receptors. So these are going to be our 2 types of touch receptors. Now there's going to be 2 types of rapidly adapting touch receptors. These are our Meissner corpuscles. These are also called our corpuscles of touch. And these are touch receptors located in the dermal papillae of hairless skin. So we can see these right here. So these are going to be receptors that detect really fine or light touch, also going to detect pressure and slow vibration. Then our other type of rapidly adapting touch receptor are going to be the hair root plexuses. I'll write that here for you.
So those are going to be down here. These are only found in hairy skin because they are surrounding hair. And these sense very crude or very harsh touch. Now, because these two are rapidly adapting receptors, they're going to generate nerve impulses mainly at the onset of touch. Now, there's also two types of slowly adapting touch receptors. First one is our type 1 cutaneous mechanoreceptors. So we could see these here. These are also called the tactile discs, the top here. These are going to be those kind of saucer-shaped, flattened, free nerve endings. And they make contact with the Merkel cells. Remember, these are the tactile epithelial cells of the stratum basale. Now, these type 1 cutaneous mechanoreceptors are going to be really abundant in the fingertips, hands, lips, and external genitalia. Now, our other slowly adapting touch receptor, I'll just put it down here. This one's going to be our type 2 cutaneous mechanoreceptors. So we see these are right here. These are also called Ruffini's corpuscles. And these are really elongated, encapsulated receptors that are located deep in the dermis, and they're also found in ligaments and tendons. Now, these types of receptors are most sensitive to stretching that occurs as digits or limbs are moved. So especially that stretching of skin, they're going to be very sensitive to, but they also do detect crude touch as well. Now let's very briefly discuss pressure. So pressure is going to be this sustained sensation that's felt over a larger area than touch, and it occurs with deformation of deeper tissues. So receptors that contribute to sensations of pressure are going to include the corpuscles of touch, the type 1 cutaneous mechanoreceptors, and also down here these lamellated corpuscles, also called Pacinian corpuscles. So this lamellated corpuscle, this is going to be a large oval structure. It's composed of multiple layers of connective tissue. It's going to be a capsule that encloses a dendrite. Now these also are quite rapidly adapting. In fact, we could probably add it to our rapidly adapting list here. So they are very rapidly, they do adapt quite rapidly, and they're very widely distributed throughout the body. They're found in the dermis, in the subcutaneous layer, in the submucosal layers. They're also found even around joints and tendons and muscles. They're found in the mammary glands, even in the urinary bladder, just to name a few. They're very widespread, these Pacinian corpuscles. Lastly, we're going to just talk about this receptor up here. So thermal receptors, these are going to be free nerve endings that have receptive fields about 1 millimeter in diameter, but they're found really, really close to the skin surface. So right at the epidermis, still within the dermis, but They're found very close to the skin surface. Now there are two types of thermal sensations, cold and warm, that are detected by different thermal receptors. There's also going to be a lot more cold receptors than warm receptors in your body. Cold receptors are much more abundant. So cold receptors more abundant there. Proprioceptive sensations, which are also just called proprioception, these allow us to recognize that parts of our body belong to us. This also allows us to know where our head and limbs are located and how they're moving, even if we're not directly looking at them. So that we can talk, we can walk, we can type or dress without using our eyes to directly look at what body part is moving. Now, proprioceptive sensations arise in receptors termed proprioceptors. So those proprioceptors are embedded in muscles and tendons, and they inform us to which degree our muscles are contracted and also the amount of tension that are in our tendons. Now, proprioceptors also allow for weight discrimination. Now, weight discrimination is the ability to assess the weight of an object. So pretty much when you pick up something, these proprioceptors allow you to determine if it requires a lot of muscular energy to lift it or if it requires not that much muscular energy. So this weight discrimination, this type of information, helps you to determine the amount of muscular effort required to perform a task. So you're going to use more muscular effort if you're picking up something that is 50 pounds as opposed to the amount of muscular effort required to pick up something that is 1 pound, for example. So our proprioceptors allow us to determine how much muscular effort we need. Now there are two specific types of proprioceptors that we should discuss, and they are muscle spindles and tendon organs. Now, muscle spindles are going to be the proprioceptive receptors or proprioceptors in skeletal muscles that monitor changes in the length of skeletal muscles, and they also participate in stretch reflexes. So by adjusting how vigorously a muscle spindle responds to the stretching of a muscle, the brain sets an overall level of muscle tone. So remember that muscle tone, I described it briefly before, but I'll put it here quick too. Muscle tone is going to be the degree of contraction, that small degree of contraction that's present when the muscle is at rest. So the brain detects how vigorously a muscle spindle responds to stretching of a skeletal muscle, and then the brain determines an overall level of muscle tone, the overall level of small contraction, even when the muscle is resting. So I'll just put this here, even though we kind of have talked about muscle tone before, but I'll just include it here. Next we have tendon organs. So these are located at the junction of a tendon and a muscle, and it protects tendons and it protects their associated muscles, and it protects them from damage due to excessive tension or overstretching. There's also going to be another type of receptor, this joint kinesthetic receptor. Now there are several types of joint kinesthetic receptors that are present within and around the articular capsules of synovial joints. So these are going to respond to pressure and acceleration and deceleration during movement. Really, they have receptors that protect against excessive strain. This is all in order to protect against damage to joints. Now, free nerve endings and type 2 cutaneous mechanoreceptors in the capsules of joints respond to that pressure. So here we can see some of those proprioceptors that we just talked about. So here we can see the muscle spindle inside here. So each muscle spindle consists of several slowly adapting sensory nerve endings that wrap around 3 to 10 of these specialized muscle fibers called intrafusal muscle fibers. Now, the main function of muscle spindles is to measure muscle length. So in muscle spindles, which monitored the changes in skeletal muscle length, you can see these sensory nerve endings wrap around the central portion of the intrafusal muscle fibers. You can see these sensory nerve endings here. And then we can also see the axons of those sensory neurons here. Really, the takeaway from this picture is that the muscle spindle will wrap around those intrafusal muscle fibers and measure muscle length. We can also see the tendon organ right here. And in tendon organs, which are going to monitor force of muscle contraction, the sensory nerve endings, these are going to be activated by increasing tension on that tendon. So here we're going to, so these are going to monitor the force of muscle contraction. So the muscle spindle and tendon organ will both kind of do different things, but at the same time, they both kind of work together to reduce injury to the tendons and muscles. So each type of receptor, tactile, thermoreceptor, pain receptor, or proprioceptor is going to be labeled here. So here we have those tactile receptors first, then thermoreceptors, pain receptors, and proprioceptors. It also shows here their structure and where they're found. And it also shows if they have a rapid or slow adaptation rate. So let's talk about neural integration. Now there are 3 main levels of neural integration that operate in the somatosensory system, and these are the receptor circuit, the circuit level, and perceptual level. So for each sensation to occur, a stimulus must excite a receptor, and action potentials have to reach the central nervous system. So this is what we get here with the receptor level. We have different receptors, free nerve endings, muscle spindles, or joint kinesthetic receptors that are going to detect a stimulus, and they're going to send their action potentials to the central nervous system, mainly first to the spinal cord. Now we have this second level of integration. So our first level here is the receptor circuit, or the receptor level. Then we get to the circuit level. And so here at the second level of integration, the circuit level, the task is to deliver impulses to the appropriate region of the cerebral cortex for localization and perception of that stimulus. So that brings us here, where we're going to send those pathways to the right place in the cerebral cortex. So here we're sending it to the somatosensory cortex or to the cerebellum. And then at our third level of integration, this is where the sensory input is interpreted by the cerebral cortex. So that's going to be just up here at the very top, where we get that processing. Stimulation of receptors in skeletal muscles, joints, tendons, and fascia causes deep somatic pain. Visceral pain is another type of pain. It is going to result from the stimulation of nociceptors in visceral organs. So these are going to be deep internal organs. Now, if stimulation is really diffuse, so if it involves very large areas, the visceral pain can be quite severe. Now, fast external pain is very precisely localized to the stimulated area. However, in many cases of visceral pain, the pain is felt in or just deep to the skin that overlies the stimulated organ, or sometimes the pain is felt in a surface area that's far from the stimulated organ. So when the pain is felt on a surface area far from the stimulated area, this phenomenon is called referred pain. So this figure here shows, in general, what skin regions would be affected to which visceral pain occurs. So these are skin regions to which visceral pain may be referred to. So in general, the visceral organ involved and the area to which the pain is referred to are served by the same segment of the spinal cord. So here you can see the heart is going to affect kind of the left skin overlying the pectoralis major muscle and all the way down the medial side of the left arm. The lung and diaphragm are going to affect kind of the front and left side of the neck and shoulder. Liver and gallbladder can refer pain to the right side of the neck and right shoulder. So very interesting where pain can be referred to from visceral pain. Again, this doesn't happen all the time. This is a phenomenon that does sometimes occur. But this just shows skin regions to where that visceral pain may be referred to. So termed referred pain here. Okay, so we're moving on to spinal nerves. So spinal nerves will send information from the peripheral sensory receptors to the spinal cord, and information from the spinal cord to the effectors. So remember the term effectors. This refers to muscles or glands. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and these are going to emerge from each side of the spinal cord through those intervertebral foramina. And the spinal nerves are named for the vertebral region and level from which they emerge. So leave the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramina. Remember, foramina is just plural for foramen. Spinal nerves connect to the spinal cord by the posterior root, also known as the dorsal root, and by the anterior or ventral root, and they are called mixed nerves. And this is because they contain both sensory and motor axons. Now, each spinal nerve and cranial nerve consists of many individual axons, and it also contains layers of protective connective tissue coverings. So this picture may look kind of similar because muscles are also arranged in this way. So each individual axon within a nerve, whether it's myelinated or not, is going to be wrapped in endoneurium. Endoneurium is the innermost layer of connective tissue. Endoneurium consists of a mesh of collagen fibers, fibroblasts, and macrophages. Now, groups of axons with their endoneurium are held together in bundles called fascicles, just like we saw with muscles. Fascicles are each wrapped in perineurium, and this is going to be the middle layer of connective tissue. The perineurium is going to be a thicker layer of connective tissue than the endoneurium. Those fascicles will all bundle together, and then we get the outermost covering of the entire nerve is the epineurium. And it consists of fibroblasts and very thick collagen fibers. We can also see this here. We can see this internal blood vessel on the right picture. We can see those axons individually, the bundles of axons making up the fascicles. And we can also see those layers of connective tissue, the endoneurium surrounding the axon, the perineurium surrounding the fascicle, and the epineurium surrounding the entire nerve. A short distance after passing through its intervertebral foramen, here or here, a spinal nerve divides into several branches. Now these branches are known as rami, or singular ramus. So the posterior ramus, or dorsal ramus, this is going to serve the deep muscles and skin of the posterior surface of the trunk. So posterior trunk there. And then the anterior ramus, also known as the ventral ramus. This is going to serve the muscles and structures of the upper limbs and the lower limbs, and also the skin of the lateral and anterior surfaces of the trunk. And also the skin of the lateral and anterior surfaces of the trunk. Now this makes sense as well, right? Because posterior to our spinal cord is really just our back muscles. There's not really much else posterior to our spinal cord. But anterior to our spinal cord, there's a lot more going on. Essentially, the whole rest of our body is anterior to our spine. And so it makes sense that the nerves going posterior out to the spinal cord are going to serve pretty much just the muscles of the back, whereas the nerves coming anterior out of the spinal cord are going to serve a lot more. Now, in addition to the posterior and anterior rami, spinal nerves also give off a meningeal branch. Now, this branch actually re-enters the vertebral cavity through the intervertebral foramen, and it supplies the vertebrae, the vertebral ligaments, the blood vessels of the spinal cord, and also the meninges. So I'll just draw this arrow down here for the meningeal branch. So this is going to go back into the space between the vertebrae, and it's going to supply the vertebrae, the vertebral ligaments, the blood vessels of the spinal cord, and then also the meninges. The meninges of the spinal cord. And then there are also the other branches of a spinal nerve, which are the rami communicantes, which are right here. In the central nervous system, the oligodendrocytes actually inhibit the growth of axons. They have these growth inhibiting proteins because there's really not much space in the central nervous system for neurons to grow more. In the peripheral nervous system, though, it is very different. Remember, we have Schwann cells, which have a neurolema. And axons and dendrites associated with a neurolema may undergo repair if the cell body is intact. So this is the cell body of the neuron. Now, a person who injures axons of a nerve of an upper limb, for example, has a really good chance of regaining nerve function because of the neurolema of Schwann cells. Now we are going to go over these steps of the repair process in the peripheral nervous system. So we have the axon fragments seal themselves off. The Schwann cells and macrophages will clean out the dead axon. We actually have what's called a regeneration tube, which is part of the repair process that the axon filaments will grow through. And then in the end, the axon regenerates and a new myelin sheath is formed. So we're going to see a picture of how this repair process occurs in the next slide. So here we can see at step 1, the axon becomes fragmented at the injury site, and the cut axon ends will actually seal themselves off. So this is where axon transport is going to be interrupted. It causes the ends to swell up. Now, without access to the cell body, the axon begins to disintegrate distal to the injury. So here we have that site of nerve damage, and we can see that fragmented axon there. Now, degeneration of the distal end of the cut axon is called Wallerian degeneration, and this spreads down the axon. So Wallerian degeneration, this is degeneration of the distal end of the cut axon. Then here, just below it, we see step 2. This is where the Schwann cells and macrophages will clean out the dead axon distal to the injury. So you can see the Schwann cells and the macrophages here. So this is where the surviving Schwann cells will engulf the myelin fragments and also secrete chemicals that recruit more macrophages to the site. So these macrophages will help to dispose of the debris and release chemicals to stimulate Schwann cells to divide. So the macrophages are going to be very, very helpful in this area. Step 3, we have in the top right corner of this picture here. This is where the axon filaments will grow through a regeneration tube that's formed by the Schwann cells. So Schwann cells will release growth factors and also express cell adhesion molecules, and these encourage axon growth. The Schwann cells will actually line up along the tube of remaining endoneurium. So we can see the endoneurium here. The Schwann cells will align up there, and they form this regeneration tube. And the regeneration tube guides the regenerating axon sprouts to cross the gap to their original contacts. So you can see those sprouts crossing the gap through that regeneration tube created by the Schwann cells. And then our last picture in the bottom right here is where the axon regenerates and a new myelin sheath forms. So the Schwann cells protect and support the regenerating axon and ultimately produce a new myelin sheath. So we're actually going to be moving on to cover all of the cranial nerves. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they're named because they pass through various foramina in the bones of the cranium and arise from the brain inside the cranial cavity. So just like the 31 pairs of spinal nerves, the cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. So these are also part of the PNS, peripheral nervous system. It's only going to be the brain and the spinal cord that's part of the central nervous system. Spinal nerves and cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. So first off, we're going to start with some of the cranial nerves. So 3 cranial nerves, 1, 2, and 8. These are going to carry axons of sensory neurons, so they're going to be called special sensory nerves. These 3 cranial nerves are unique to the head, and they are associated with the special senses of smelling or olfaction, seeing or vision, and hearing and equilibrium. Now there are 5 cranial nerves that are classified only as motor nerves, and this is because they contain only axons of motor neurons as they leave the brainstem. So our motor cranial nerves are going to be cranial nerve 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12. And then we can add our special sensory nerves up here. So our special sensory cranial nerves are 1, 2, and 8. So again, these motor nerves are only going to contain axons of motor neurons as they leave the brainstem. So that would be the oculomotor, the trochlear, the abducens, and then also we will see on the next page the accessory and hypoglossal. But you can see here these are just motor nerves. So here the accessory and hypoglossal are both going to be motor nerves. Then the remaining 4 cranial nerves are going to be mixed nerves. So that is that they contain axons of both sensory neurons entering the brainstem, and they also contain motor neurons leaving the brainstem. So our mixed cranial nerves, these are going to be 5, the vagus nerve, 7, which is the facial nerve, 9, which is the glossopharyngeal, and 10, which is the vagus nerve. So we can see the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves on this slide here, and we can see that they are mixed nerves, so they contain both sensory and motor nerves. Now there is a mnemonic here at the bottom for remembering the cranial nerves. You can use this one to help you memorize the cranial nerves, or there's also, I'm sure, other mnemonics online that may help you as well. So first we have the olfactory nerve. This is the first cranial nerve. It is entirely sensory. The olfactory epithelium is going to occupy the superior part of the nasal cavity. So we can see it here. It covers the inferior surface of the cribriform plate and extending down along the superior nasal concha. So we could also see here, we kind of have a zoomed in picture here, the cribriform plate, and then that olfactory epithelium covering the inferior part of the cribriform plate. Now the olfactory receptors within the olfactory epithelium, these are going to be bipolar neurons. So each has a single odor-sensitive knob-shaped dendrite that's projecting out one side of the cell body, and an unmyelinated axon extending out the other side. So that dendrite is odor-sensitive. Now, olfactory nerves end in the brain in paired masses of gray matter called the olfactory bulb. These are 2 extensions of the brain that rest on the cribriform plate. Now, the axons of these neurons make up the olfactory tract. And we have 2 of them, so 2 olfactory bulbs, 2 olfactory tracts here, as you can see. And these olfactory tracts extend posteriorly from the olfactory bulbs, and the axons of the olfactory tracts will end in the primary olfactory area in the temporal lobe of the cerebral cortex. Next, we have the optic nerve, the second cranial nerve. Again, this nerve is entirely sensory. And this is all in the eye. So in the retina here, the rods and cones are going to initiate visual signals and relay them to bipolar cells, which transmit the signals to ganglion cells, and those ganglion cells will travel up to the optic nerve. Now, about 10 millimeters posterior to the eyeball, the two optic nerves will merge to form the optic chiasm. And chiasm kind of means a crossover, as in the letter X. And within the optic chiasm, axons from the medial half of each eye will cross to the opposite side. And we will see this more when we look at the special senses and we look at vision specifically, but axons from the medial part of each eye will cross over at this optic chiasm, and then axons from the lateral half will actually remain on the same side. Now, posterior to the chiasm, these regrouped axons, some from each eye, will actually form what's called the optic tracts. So the optic nerve only has to do with vision. The oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens nerves are the cranial nerves that control the muscles that move the eyeballs. They are all motor nerves that contain only motor axons as they exit the brainstem, though we will talk about each of these individually. So first here, we're going to look at the oculomotor nerve, which is the third cranial nerve, one right here. So again, this is a motor nerve as it contains only motor neuron axons. Okay, so the oculomotor nerve is going to extend anteriorly, and it actually divides into a superior branch and an inferior branch. Now, both these branches will pass through the superior orbital fissure into the actual orbit, the part containing the eyeball. Now, axons in the superior branch will innervate the superior rectus muscle and the levator palpebrae superioris muscle. So those are going to be the superior branch. Just kind of label these 1 and 2 from the superior branch. Then the inferior branch will supply the medial rectus muscle, the inferior rectus muscle, which is down here, and the inferior oblique muscles. These are going to be all extrinsic eye muscles. I'll write this on here. So the inferior branch, going to innervate these 3 muscles. Again, these are extrinsic eye muscles. So extrinsic eye muscles just means that they are muscles on the outside of the eyeball. So they will move the eyeball itself. Now, the inferior branch of the oculomotor nerve also supplies parasympathetic motor axons to intrinsic eyeball muscles. So these mostly consist of smooth muscle. Now, these intrinsic eye muscles include the ciliary muscle, which is going to be here. The ciliary muscle of the eyeball, and it's also going to supply the circular muscles of the iris.
So these are going to be intrinsic eye muscles. Now, the parasympathetic impulses will propagate from a nucleus in the midbrain to the ciliary ganglia, which have axons that will extend to the ciliary muscle. And the ciliary muscle actually functions to adjust the lens for near vision. And the other axons will stimulate the circular muscles of the iris, which function in constricting the pupil. This will allow less light into your eyeball. Next, we have the trochlear nerve. This is the fourth cranial nerve, and it's actually the smallest of the 12 cranial nerves, and it's the only one that arises from the posterior aspect of the brainstem. These somatic motor neurons innervate the superior oblique muscle of the eyeball that controls movement of the eyeball. So again, this is going to be a motor nerve. The trigeminal nerve is the fifth cranial nerve, and it gets its name from having 3 branches. That's where the tri comes from. Now this is a mixed cranial nerve, and this is the largest of the cranial nerves. Now it emerges from roots on the anterolateral surface of the pons, and there's a large sensory root that has a swelling called the trigeminal ganglion. And within the trigeminal ganglion, there are cell bodies of most of the primary sensory neurons in this nerve. Now the 3 branches of the trigeminal nerve are the ophthalmic branch, the maxillary branch, and the mandibular branch. The ophthalmic branch, this is the smallest branch to pass into the orbit by the superior orbital fissure, and it carries sensory axons from the skin over the upper eyelid, cornea, lacrimal glands, the upper part of the nasal cavity, the side of the nose, forehead, and the anterior half of the scalp. So we're getting kind of sensory all over. So this one is just sensory. Sorry, this line here is actually probably too low. It's probably more all up here. Because we're getting into the lacrimal glands, upper eyelids here, cornea, all around there. Okay, then the maxillary branch. This is intermediate in size between the ophthalmic and the mandibular branch, and it passes through the foramen rotundum. Now this nerve is also sensory, and it has sensory axons from the mucosa of the nose, the palate, part of the pharynx, kind of back here, the upper teeth here, upper lip, and also the lower eyelid. Then the mandibular nerve, or mandibular branch. This is the largest branch, and it passes through the foramen ovale.
And it includes sensory axons from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. This is not for taste, but more for touch and pressure and pain receptors. It also includes the cheek, the lower teeth, the skin over the mandible, and the side of the head anterior to the ear. So this is the sensory portion. And then it also has a motor portion, mainly covering the temporalis muscle and then the muscles for chewing. Next, we have the abducens nerve. This is the 6th cranial nerve. And neurons of the abducens nerve originate from a nucleus in the pons, down here. This is also a motor nerve. So the somatic motor axons extend from the nucleus to the lateral rectus muscle of the eyeball. This is also an extrinsic eyeball muscle. And the abducens nerve is named that because the nerve impulses cause abduction, or this is lateral rotation of the eyeball. The facial nerve, this is a mixed cranial nerve. Its sensory axons extend from the taste buds of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So remember the last one we talked about the trigeminal nerve doesn't include the taste buds. The facial nerve does include taste buds from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. And this cranial nerve will enter the temporal bone, joining the main facial nerve here at the geniculate ganglion. The geniculate ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies of sensory neurons of the facial nerve within the temporal bone, and it ends in the pons. Now, the sensory portion of the facial nerve also contains axons from skin in the ear canal that relay touch, pain, and thermal sensations. And it also relays from proprioceptors from muscles of the face and scalp to relay their information through cell bodies in the midbrain. Now, axons of the brachial motor neurons arise from a nucleus in the pons and exit by the stylomastoid foramen. And it innervates the middle ear, the face, scalp, and also some neck muscles down here. So this is going to be your motor portion. The vestibulocochlear nerve is the 8th cranial nerve. This is a sensory cranial nerve, and it also has 2 branches, the vestibular branch and the cochlear branch. Now, the vestibular branch carries impulses for equilibrium, and the cochlear branch carries impulses for hearing. So an important distinction there. Sensory axons in the vestibular branch extend from the semicircular canals and the saccule and utricle of the inner ear. and they go to the vestibular ganglion. This is where the cell bodies of the neurons are located. And these nerves will end in the vestibular nucleus in the pons and will also go to the cerebellum, since this is the equilibrium branch. The cerebellum has to do with equilibrium and keeping balance. Now, sensory axons in the cochlear branch, they arise from the spiral organ in the cochlea of the inner ear. And cell bodies of the cochlear branch are actually located in the spiral ganglia of the cochlea. Next, we have the glossopharyngeal nerve, the 9th cranial nerve. This is a mixed cranial nerve. Now, the sensory axons of the glossopharyngeal nerve arise from 5 different places. So the first one is the taste buds of the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, kind of what wasn't covered with the facial nerve. Proprioceptors from swallowing muscles. Also the baroreceptors. These are pressure detecting receptors. And these are found in the carotid sinus. These monitor blood pressure. We're also going to get sensory receptors and chemoreceptors of the glossopharyngeal nerve. So chemoreceptors are receptors that monitor blood levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide. These are going to be found in the carotid bodies. And then lastly, we're going to get sensory axons from the external ear. And this will convey touch, pain, and thermal sensations. Now, the cell bodies of these sensory neurons are located in the superior and inferior ganglion. And as this is a mixed nerve, there are also motor axons associated. And so there are brachial motor neurons that innervate the stylopharyngeus muscle. It's not really labeled on here, but I'll write it in. So the motor axons will innervate the stylopharyngeus muscle. And this is a muscle that assists in swallowing. There are also going to be axons of the parasympathetic motor neurons that stimulate the parotid gland to secrete saliva as well. The vagus nerve. This is a mixed cranial nerve as well, and it's distributed from the head and neck as well as into the thorax and abdomen. Now, this nerve really derives its name from having a really wide distribution. So the sensory axons of the vagus nerve will branch to innervate the external ear, the taste buds in the epiglottis and pharynx. Also going to get proprioceptors in the neck and the throat. Baroreceptors in the carotid sinus, and chemoreceptors in the carotid bodies as well as the aortic bodies. And these sensory neurons have their cell bodies in the superior and inferior ganglion here. And then they pass through the jugular foramen to end in the medulla oblongata and the pons. Now for the motor portion, we have brachiomotor neurons supply the muscles of the pharynx and larynx, as well as the soft palate that are used in swallowing, vocalization, and coughing. I'll change the color here. So this is part of the brachiomotor neurons. Then there's also axons of the parasympathetic motor neurons in the vagus nerve, will also supply the lungs, the heart, glands of the gastrointestinal tract, the smooth muscle of the respiratory passageways, also the esophagus, the stomach, the gallbladder, also the small intestine and large intestine as well. And parasympathetic motor axons will also initiate smooth muscle contractions in the gastrointestinal tract to aid in mobility of food through the digestive tract, and also they'll also stimulate secretion by digestive glands. So all of, probably from like the larynx and the whole GI tract, these are all supplied by axons of the parasympathetic motor neurons. So these parasympathetic motor neurons of the vagus nerve innervate a lot of gastrointestinal organs. The accessory nerve is the 11th cranial nerve. This is a brachial motor cranial nerve. So the accessory nerve is going to convey motor impulses to the sternocleidomastoid muscle in the neck, and also the trapezius muscle of the neck and shoulders, and these work to coordinate head movements. The hypoglossal nerve, which is the 12th and last cranial nerve, this is also a motor cranial nerve, and it supplies the muscles of the tongue. So these axons will conduct nerve impulses for speech and swallowing. The cervical plexus is formed by roots, which are anterior rami, of the first 4 cervical nerves.
C1 through C4. These are cervical spinal cord nerves. And then with some contributions from C5. There's one along each side of the neck, along the first 4 cervical vertebrae. The cervical plexus supplies the skin and muscles of the head, also the neck and superior part of the shoulders and the chest. The phrenic nerve arises from the cervical plexus, and it supplies motor fibers to the diaphragm. So this is an important nerve to know that comes from the cervical plexus. The roots of the spinal nerves C5 to C8 and also T1 form the brachial plexus. And this extends inferiorly and laterally on either side of the first or the last 4 cervical vertebrae and the first thoracic vertebrae. It passes above the first rib, posterior to the clavicle, and then enters the axilla. The relationships with the nerves coming from the brachial plexus are roots, trunks, divisions, cords, and then branches, with them dividing and merging back up with one another, as we can kind of see better from the actual nerves on the prior slide. There's also a mnemonic on the prior slide to remember the subunits, but we start with the roots being the spinal cord nerves. They kind of a couple of them merge together into the trunks, which will then split into divisions. The divisions, some merge and split together into the cords, and then divide into the peripheral or terminal branches. Now, the brachial plexus provides almost the entire nerve supply of the shoulder and upper limbs. The 5 terminal branches arise from the brachial plexus. We saw this in the last slide, but I will also write them out here. So these are the terminal branches. First one here is the axillary nerve. So this one is labeled here on the picture. This supplies the deltoid and teres minor muscles. Now the muscles and their nerve innervations we'll cover a little bit more in the lab, but it's good to review it here as well. Our second is the musculocutaneous nerve. And this supplies the anterior muscles of the arm. This one is labeled just here on the picture. Oops. Our third is the radial nerve. This supplies the muscles on the posterior aspect of the arm and forearm. Okay, we'll do 4 and 5 just up here. Four is the median nerve. Oh, sorry, I didn't get the radial nerve on the picture here. Radial nerve is here, median nerve is just here. The median nerve, this supplies most of the muscles of the anterior forearm and some of the muscles of the hand. Some of the hand muscles. And then our fifth terminal branch here is going to be the ulnar nerve. And this one is just labeled here. Well, it's a couple places here, but here and here. And the ulnar nerve supplies the anteromedial muscles of the forearm and most of the muscles of the hand. And then we'll say most hand. Most of the muscles of the hand here. Since the brachial plexus is so complex, an explanation of its various parts could be helpful. So as with the cervical and other plexuses, the roots are the anterior rami of the spinal nerves. Now the roots of several spinal nerves unite to form the trunks in the inferior part of the neck. So the trunks are from, I'll just say united roots. Now the trunks are going to be the superior, middle, and inferior trunks. Now just posterior to the clavicles, the trunks diverge into divisions, which are the anterior and posterior divisions. So divisions are going to be divided trunks. In the axillae, the divisions will then unite to form cords called the lateral, medial, and posterior cords. Now the cords are named for their relationship to the axillary artery, a large artery that supplies blood to the upper limb. Then the branches, these are going to form the principal nerves of the brachial plexus. So we see all these branches here, the nerves axillary, musculocutaneous, median, ulnar, radial, and then some smaller ones here that you'll see on your lab but aren't as important for our class. Pectoral might be another big one that you should know, but in general these are more for the lab information. Now the roots, remember the anterior rami of spinal nerves L1 through L4 form the lumbar plexus. Unlike the brachial plexus, there's going to be really minimal intermingling of fibers in the lumbar plexus. On either side of the first four lumbar vertebrae, the lumbar plexus passes obliquely outward between the superficial and deep heads of the psoas major muscle and anterior to the quadratus lumborum muscle. Now, the roots of the lumbar plexus will split into anterior and posterior divisions, which then will give rise to the peripheral branches of the plexus. The lumbar plexus supplies the anterolateral abdominal wall, external genitals, and part of the lower limbs. Here are the major nerves of the lumbar plexus. For our purposes, The obturator and the femoral nerve are going to be the ones that come up most often, especially in lab, but these are going to be the major ones that we should know for class. Now the roots of spinal nerves L4, L5, and then S1 to S4, these are going to form the sacral plexus. Now this plexus is situated largely anterior to the sacrum. The sacral plexus supplies nerves to the buttocks, the perineum, and the lower limbs. Now the largest nerve in the body, the sciatic nerve, which is labeled here, this comes from the sacral plexus. Now the roots of spinal nerves S4 and S5, these form the coccygeal plexus. This supplies a small area of skin in the coccygeal region. Here's a list of the sacral and coccygeal nerves and what they control. Again, that sciatic nerve is going to be the largest nerve in our body. And then the gluteal nerves are going to be other ones that you should know. Posterior femoral cutaneous might be another one as well. The skin over the entire body is supplied by somatic sensory neurons that carry nerve impulses from the skin into the spinal cord and the brain. Now, each spinal nerve contains sensory neurons that serve a specific, predictable segment of the body. Now, one of the cranial nerves, the trigeminal nerve, this serves most of the skin of the face and the scalp. Now, the area of the skin that provides sensory input to the central nervous system by one pair of spinal nerves, or the trigeminal nerve, is called a dermatome. So the nerve supply in adjacent dermatomes overlaps a little bit, but generally we have what is shown in this picture on the left here. So each segment of the spinal cord, say for example C2, is going to supply this part of the neck and also the back of the scalp. C6 is going to supply the lateral side of the forearm and hands, and so on and so forth, so that each segment of the spinal cord carries somatic sensory nerve impulses to these specific areas of the skin. Now, the spinal cord also promotes homeostasis by serving as an integrating center for some reflexes. Now, the term reflex, this means a fast, involuntary, and unplanned sequence of actions that occurs in response to a particular stimulus. Now, some reflexes are inborn, or they're in you as you're born. So things like pulling your hand away from a hot surface before you even feel that it's hot. These are going to be inborn reflexes, while other reflexes are learned or acquired. So for instance, you learn a lot of reflexes while acquiring driving expertise. Slamming on the brakes in an emergency is one example of an acquired reflex. If integration takes place in the spinal cord gray matter, the reflex is called a spinal reflex. An example is the really familiar patellar reflex or the knee-jerk reflex. If integration occurs in the brainstem rather than in the spinal cord, this reflex is called a cranial reflex. An example of a cranial reflex would be tracking movements of your eyes as you read a sentence. Now, you're probably aware of somatic reflexes, which involve the contraction of skeletal muscles. Equally important, though, are the autonomic or visceral reflexes. I'll fix that here. These are visceral reflexes. Now, these are generally not consciously perceived, and these are more like your internal organ reflexes. Nerve impulses propagating into, through, and out of the central nervous system follow very specific pathways. And depending on the kind of information, its origin, and its destination will kind of depend on which pathway this information will take. Now, the pathway followed by nerve impulses that produce a reflex is called a reflex arc. So reflex arc is going to be the pathway followed by nerve impulses producing a reflex. So we can see a reflex arc in this picture here. So we have the sensory receptor is going to be kind of the first step in the reflex arc, where we have a stimulus, this nail here, which is going to produce a pain response. So the sensory neuron, well, this receptor first detects that pain of the nail. That information flows along the sensory neuron to the interneuron, which is going to be that integrating center. The interneuron will integrate the information and decide we need to move our muscle away from this pain. We'll send that information along the motor neuron to the effector, which is the muscle in this case. So here are some terms that we need to familiarize ourselves with that all have to do with reflex arcs. First one is ipsilateral here. So an ipsilateral reflex arc are reflexes in which the response occurs on the same side of the body that is stimulated. So our response is on the same side as the stimulation. A contralateral reflex arc, these are reflexes which the response occurs on the opposite side of the body that is stimulated. And then we have monosynaptic versus polysynaptic. So a monosynaptic reflex arc is the simplest form of reflex arc. This is where the integrating center is the synapse between a single sensory neuron and a single motor neuron. Now all monosynaptic reflexes are ipsilateral. So this only involves a single synapse. Again, just between a single sensory neuron and a single motor neuron. And these types are all ipsilateral. A polysynaptic reflex arc involves more than two types of neurons and more than one central nervous system synapse. So that simple reflex arc that we saw on the last slide is actually a polysynaptic reflex arc because it involves a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and a motor neuron. Then we have reciprocal innervation. So this is the arrangement where the components of a neural circuit simultaneously cause contraction of one muscle and relaxation of its antagonist. So essentially, reciprocal innervation is where one single neural circuit can contract one muscle and also relax the opposing muscle. So we're going to see that actually in all of our reflexes though. So when you kick your knee out, your quadricep muscle is going to contract kicking the leg forward, but at the same time, your hamstring has to relax in order to allow for that movement, as an example of reciprocal innervation. If both your quadriceps muscle and your hamstrings muscle both contract at the same time, there's going to be no movement because they're both trying to extend and reflex the leg at the same time. So there's going to be no movement. So in order to have movement at a joint, we have to have reciprocal innervation to contract one muscle, but also relax the opposing muscle. So the first reflex that we'll look at here is the stretch reflex. Now the stretch reflex causes contraction of a skeletal muscle in response to the stretching of the muscle. So this type of reflex occurs by a monosynaptic reflex arc. So slight stretching of muscle stimulates sensory receptors called muscle spindles. So the spindles will monitor changes in the length of the muscle, and in response to being stretched, a muscle spindle will generate one or more nerve impulses that propagate along the sensory neuron. So we see this here when we hit with a little rubber hammer, like right here. We hit this tendon, which is going to stretch the muscle. So these muscle spindles in the quadriceps muscle will detect that hammer hitting the tendon and stretching out the muscle. And this sensory receptor detects that. And that information will move along the sensory neuron. And here we have a monosynaptic reflex right here. So that one synapse between the sensory neuron and this motor neuron. And in the spinal cord, we have the integrating center, where that sensory neuron activates the motor neuron. And this motor neuron is going to send that information to the effector, which is the quadriceps muscle, which is the same muscle that was activated, or that was that the stretch was detected in. And it's going to contract the muscle to relieve the stretching. Now at the same time, we also have this second part of the circuit occurring right here, where we have this inhibitory interneuron. So this is where we get that reciprocal innervation. So the stretch reflex is a monosynaptic ipsilateral or monosynaptic ipsilateral reflex. But at the same time, we have this polysynaptic inhibition occurring also, because you need that reciprocal innervation. Also need that in work, or also at work in this reflex. So here we have that inhibitory interneuron in the spinal cord that synapses to this motor neuron. And so the motor neuron to the hamstring muscles, this antagonistic muscle in this reflex, is going to be inhibited. And so the muscle will relax. And this is the opposing muscle to the quadriceps muscle, the muscle on the opposite side of the joint. So in order for the leg to kick out like this, we need contraction of this muscle and relaxation of this muscle. Now the stretch reflex operates as a feedback mechanism to control muscle length by causing muscle contraction. In contrast, the tendon reflex, which is on this page, operates as a feedback mechanism to control muscle tension by causing muscle relaxation before muscle force becomes too great that the tendons might be torn. The tendon reflex is less sensitive than the stretch reflex, but it can very easily override the stretch reflex when the tension is really great. So this will actually make you like drop a very heavy weight, for example, because that tendon reflex will actually override the stretch reflex. Now, just like the stretch reflex, the tendon reflex is going to be ipsilateral. And the sensory receptors for this reflex are the tendon organs, also known as the Golgi tendons. So we can see these right here. Remember, those are going to be within the tendon to detect tendon stretching, or tendon tension, sorry. So here we have this increased tension is detected by those tendon receptors. That information is sent through the sensory neuron to the spinal cord, where we have this integrating center, where the sensory neuron will activate an inhibitory interneuron. This inhibitory interneuron will synapse with the motor neuron, and it will actually inhibit it to relax the effector muscle, which is the quadriceps muscle. It's going to be the same muscle that's attached to the tendon of this reflex. And it will relax the muscle in order to relieve that excess tension. There's going to also be that reciprocal innervation as well, where the sensory neuron also synapses with an excitatory interneuron. That excitatory interneuron is going to synapse with another motor neuron, the motor neuron that goes to the antagonistic muscle, which is going to contract that muscle, which also acts to relieve the tension on the opposing muscle. So if we contract the hamstring muscle in this case, it's also going to work to relieve tension that's felt in the tendons of the quadriceps muscle. A reflex involving a larger polysynaptic reflex arc occurs when, for instance, you step on a tack. In response to really painful stimulus like this, you immediately withdraw your leg. Now this is called the flexor reflex, also known as the withdrawal reflex, and there are several steps to this reflex. Now, just like other reflexes so far, this is also an ipsilateral reflex. Remember, so this means that the stimulus occurs on the same side of the body that the effector muscle or that the response is. Now this is where we have the sensory neuron going up to the spinal cord. Now, because the nerve impulses from one sensory neuron can ascend and descend to and activate interneurons in several segments of the spinal cord, this type of reflex is called an intersegmental reflex arc. So you can see the sensory neuron comes into one level of the spinal cord right here. So this level of the spinal cord is where that sensory neuron comes into. But then we have these interneurons that will ascend and descend to adjacent areas of the spinal cord. So we're going to, with those integrating centers, the sensory neuron will activate interneurons in several spinal cord segments. So through these intersegmental reflex arcs, a single sensory neuron can activate several motor neurons, thereby stimulating more than one effector. So this is possible. So in this case, we're going to have this sensory neuron become excited when you step on a tack or stub your toe or something like that. And it's going to come into the spinal cord at one segment. activate an interneuron in that segment and also activate interneurons going to adjacent segments. Those interneurons are all going to synapse with different motor neurons. So motor neuron here, and then 2 other motor neurons here. And in this case, all those motor neurons will activate one large effector muscle. So these are going to be the flexor muscles, the hamstring in this case, which is going to withdraw the leg from the painful stimulus. So this is that withdrawal reflex. Now something else may happen when you step on a tack or stub your toe. You may start to lose your balance as your body weight shifts to the other foot because you're withdrawing your one leg. For example, you're withdrawing your right leg. So you're kind of removing all that weight from your right leg from the flexor reflex. So you may kind of lose your balance unless you put your left leg down to support yourself. So besides initiating the flexor reflex that causes you to withdraw your limb, the pain impulses from stepping on the tack or stubbing your toe also initiate this crossed extensor reflex. And this is a reflex that helps you to maintain your balance in these instances. Now, unlike the flexor reflex, which is an ipsilateral reflex, the crossed extensor reflex involves a contralateral reflex arc. I'll put this in the yellow again here. So sensory impulses will enter one side of the spinal cord, so we can see them. Maybe I'll circle it here. So we can see these sensory impulses coming in this side of the spinal cord here, right? And motor impulses in this case are going to exit on the other side. So you can see those here. So here we have this crossed extensor reflex, and it's going to synchronize the extension of the contralateral limb, so the extension of the left leg in this case, and this is due to the interneurons crossing over to the other side here. And it synchronizes that extension with the contralateral limb with the withdrawal of the ipsilateral stimulated limb. So that if you stub your toe or step on a tack and you withdraw that limb, your opposite limb is going to extend so that you don't fall over. Now reflexes are really important. You may think that just hitting your knee with a rubber hammer is just kind of a silly thing. It doesn't really matter all that much, but they are very, very important. And this is because reflexes, even simple reflexes like the knee jerk reflex, are very important for diagnosing disorders of the nervous system. They are also important for locating injured tissue. So if you have an injured spinal cord, and you have certain reflexes that are missing, a doctor can use that information to help diagnose where exactly in your spinal cord that injury is. So again, if that reflex is absent or even just abnormal, if you have a large knee jerk reflex, you kick your leg out like crazy, that's an abnormal reflex. That also can be used to help diagnose disorders or injuries. So very important that reflexes are tested, and also important that we have reflexes.